I didn't come to the valley for drama. After 23 years in the military and one bitter divorce that gutted more than just my bank account, all I wanted was quiet, solitude, a place where I could hear the wind before I heard voices. So when I found the old cedar cabin nestled by the stream, it felt like something sacred had been waiting for me all along. I bought it the same day I saw it. The cabin sat on 3 acres of gently sloping land at the edge of the Green Ridge development, which was still technically under HOA governance, but my property, along with 3 others along the stream, had been carved out before the HOA was formed. We weren't part of it. The lines were clear on every deed, every map. The stream acted as a natural boundary, and I liked it that way. My little patch of land had willows leaning over the water like they were praying. Wild irises burst open each spring, and if you knew where to stand, you could watch the foxes dart across the stones at dawn. I fixed up the place myself, built a porch with wide railings where I could drink my coffee in the mornings and watch the mist drift above the stream. Repaired the old watermill wheel just for the pleasure of hearing it creak again. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't modern. But it was mine. The people up the hill in Green Ridge were nice enough, I suppose, mostly retirees and remote-working tech folks who liked the idea of nature as long as it stayed behind a fence. They built fences a lot in Green Ridge. Fancy ones with little brass numbers and matching mailboxes. Every lawn the same length, every tree trimmed like it was in boot camp. There was always a rule being enforced. Trash bins were color-coded. Holiday decorations came with time limits. And God help you if your shutters didn't match your siding. At first, the HOA left me alone. Technically, they had no jurisdiction here. I was beyond their fence line, beyond their bylaws. I nodded politely when I passed people on my grocery run, but I didn't join their meetings and I didn't let their landscapers anywhere near my creek. My land was wild on purpose. Then she arrived. Her name was Karen Mulbridge. She moved into Green Ridge 2 years after me, into the biggest house on the highest hill, complete with 4-car garage and a wine cellar visible through tempered glass. The kind of place that looks like it came out of a luxury home magazine and had about as much warmth. I didn't know her well at first, but I knew the type. She wore pastel polos with diamonds on her wrist and corrected people's grammar in casual conversation. She was elected to the HOA board within 6 weeks. It started small, as it always does. A printed note tucked under my windshield while I was parked at the community grocery store: please refrain from leaving muddy tire tracks in the parking lot. We all share this space, never mind that the mud came from the same rain that drenched her pristine dog park. Then came a knock on my door from a smiling man in khakis named Trevor, who politely suggested that someone from the HOA had asked if I might consider clearing the overgrowth near the stream for better visibility. Visibility for what I asked? The fish. He laughed awkwardly and left. I wasn't angry then, just amused. I'd seen bureaucracy before. I'd lived through worse. But something in Karen's tone whenever I did cross paths with her made me itch. She had that smugness that comes from people who think paperwork is power. She liked calling things unsightly. She used the word community like it was a brand she owned. And she didn't like fences she couldn't control. Still, for a time, nothing happened. Spring rolled around and I went back to my usual routines, cleaning the stream path, planting herbs near the porch, patching the tin roof before the summer rains. I hosted a barbecue one weekend for an old army buddy and his wife. We drank beer, told lies about how young we used to be, and laughed until the fireflies blinked out. But peace has a way of drawing predators. And I didn't see it then, but my land untouched, scenic, and just outside HOA rules wasn't invisible anymore. Not to someone like Karen. It began with a rumor. I overheard it at the feed store one Saturday morning. 2 Green Ridge residents were chatting while waiting for birdseed. They say Karen's got plans for some kind of nature lodge. You know, rustic charm meets 5-star spa. She wants to reclaim the lower lot, make it profitable. The lower lot. That was my land. I didn't say anything. Not then. Maybe they meant the other side of the creek. Maybe it was all just HOA fantasy talk. I didn't want to believe someone could be so arrogant, so entitled that they'd set their sights on property they didn't even own. But deep down I felt it, a shift, like the creek itself had taken a breath. Because when people like Karen talk about reclaiming, they don't mean working with the land. They mean paving it over. And I'd worked too hard, lost too much to let that happen again. Not here. Not this stream. Not this time. It was a Tuesday morning when I saw them, two men in neon orange vests, standing on my land like they owned the sunrise. At first, I thought they were with the city, maybe storm drainage or utility checks. But then I noticed one of them unrolling a measuring tape across the wildflower path I'd carved out myself. The other had a drone buzzing just above the canopy of the willow trees, sweeping in long mechanical arcs. I stepped off my porch slowly, coffee still warm in my hand, boots crunching through the gravel. The man with the drone looked up startled, then motioned for the other to turn around. "Can I help you fellas?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "Just conducting a site survey," the first one said, smiling, like this was all perfectly normal. His name tag read Darren with a clipboard, and the kind of pen that clicks too many times in nervous hands. A site survey for what I asked, already knowing I wasn't going to like the answer. He glanced at his clipboard. "For the proposed Green Ridge Riverside Wellness Retreat. Preliminary mapping and elevation study. Nothing invasive." I stared at him, then past him, then at the edge of my stream, where one of them had stuck a bright pink flag into the mossy bank on my side. "This is private property," I said, walking toward the flag and yanking it out with one clean pull. "I didn't authorize any survey." Darren's smile faltered. "Our documents show this area is within the proposed development zone, sir." I stepped closer, met his eyes. "Your documents are wrong." He looked like he wanted to argue. His partner didn't. The man with the drone tapped a few times on his tablet, packed it away, and started back toward their truck. I didn't move until both men were in their vehicle, backing up down the gravel road that bordered my southern fence line. Darren gave a half-hearted wave out the window. I didn't return it. When they were gone, I stood there for a while, pink flag still in my hand, watching the wind ripple through the cattails along the stream bed. A hawk circled high above, crying into the empty blue. I didn't need to guess who was behind this. I already knew. Karen. She'd found a way to escalate. Bypass conversation. Skip diplomacy. Go straight to action. It wasn't just a rumor anymore. It was a plan. And now it had feet on my ground. I went back inside and pulled out the manila folder I kept in the fireproof lockbox beneath my bed. Inside were the original deeds signed decades ago, when the land was first parceled out. I had maps, topographical zoning, even one I'd commissioned myself when I first bought the place. And every one of them confirmed the same thing: my land ended 5 feet beyond the northern bank of the stream. Karen and her HOA had no claim, no jurisdiction, no right. But I'd been around long enough to know that people like Karen didn't need truth to move forward, they just needed momentum. That evening, I drove into town and made copies of every document. 3 sets. One for me, one for a lawyer I hadn't hired yet, and one just in case something accidentally went missing in the future. The next morning, I took a walk down to the part of the creek where they'd dropped the flags. I noticed something I'd missed the day before: a stake with bright orange spray paint hammered into the dirt right at the edge of my fence line. Zip-tied to the top was a laminated page showing a mock-up wooden cabins perched along the waterline, connected by boardwalks, and labeled things like Tranquility Vista and Zen Den. There were smiling silhouettes in bathrobes holding green smoothies. At the bottom was a logo: Green Ridge HOA Development Committee. I took the page down, carefully folded it, and brought it home. That afternoon, I called the number at the bottom of the flyer. It led, unsurprisingly, to the HOA's community office. A chipper voice greeted me. "Green Ridge HOA, this is Mandy. How can I assist you?" "I need to speak with Karen Mulbridge," I said flat. "She's not available at the moment. May I take a message?" "No," I said. "I'll handle this in person." I showed up at the next HOA meeting that Thursday evening. I hadn't been in their clubhouse before: an air-conditioned temple to forced cheerfulness, complete with framed community values quotes and fake succulents on every table. Karen was seated at the head of the U-shaped board table, wearing a lavender blazer and a face full of forced patience. She smiled when she saw me, but her eyes were knives. "Mr. Granger?" she said, using my last name like it was a stain. "To what do we owe this unexpected visit?" "I think you already know," I replied, pulling out a copy of my property map and sliding it across the table. "Your surveyors trespassed on my land. Your development plans show cabins on territory you don't own. I want an explanation, now." Karen didn't even look at the papers. "The board has reason to believe that the creek boundary is ambiguous. Our environmental consultant indicated—" I cut her off. "There's no ambiguity. It's a matter of public record. I have every deed, every map, every piece of documentation confirming my boundary. You're on the wrong side of it." A murmur rippled through the board members. Karen tapped her pen on the table. "Well, perhaps there was a clerical error. Let's reconvene when we've reviewed the documents." "No," I said. "You don't get to flatten land you don't own and then say, 'Oops, call off the project, now.'" Her smile finally cracked. "You may want to consult a lawyer before making accusations," she said, her voice cold. "This project has significant support. The community stands to benefit." "From cabins built on stolen land," I asked. "From a floodplain, you clearly don't understand." That word hit her. Floodplain. She blinked, just for a moment. Then she leaned back, folded her arms, and said, "You'll be hearing from our legal team." I nodded once, gathered my papers, and left. I didn't slam the door, but I wanted to. As I walked back to my truck, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was preparing. Because now I knew how far she was willing to go, and I wasn't about to let her go any further. The first public announcement came 2 days after the board meeting. It was printed in the Green Ridge newsletter and mailed to every home in the development except mine. But I got a copy anyway. Dana, one of the quieter board members who had given me a sympathetic glance during my confrontation with Karen, dropped it off at my gate. No note, just the newsletter folded neatly and circled in red ink. The headline read, "Green Ridge HOA unveils Riverside Wellness Retreat, a new chapter of community connection and healing." The language was pure marketing fluff. Talk of natural immersion, therapeutic streamside lodgings, eco-luxury experience for our residents and their guests. They promised the project would generate revenue for community upgrades and serve as a model for HOA-led innovation. The article listed a projected completion date of 10 months and featured quotes from Karen that made me grit my teeth. "We are proud to lead Green Ridge into a brighter, more balanced future by embracing the harmony between wellness and nature. The land has been underutilized for far too long. It's time to make it flourish." Underutilized. That word stuck in my chest like a nail. The land she was referring to was mine. The wild slope that dropped gently into the stream, where deer came to drink at dawn, and woodpeckers nested in the elder trees. I had spent years letting it grow wild, not out of laziness, but out of respect. Not every piece of earth needs to be paved, polished, or painted with profit. Karen didn't understand that. Or worse, she didn't care. By the following week, banners had gone up at the community center showing artist renderings of the retreat, 10 luxury cabins, made of reclaimed wood, or so they claimed, a central spa pavilion with outdoor massage decks, and a curved footbridge that arched dramatically over the stream, right where my willow trees stood. I began receiving calls from neighbors I barely knew. "Hey Granger, are you really blocking the project? Karen says you're holding up progress over some paperwork. She told us you were being territorial." One man said, "Come on, it's just land. You don't even use it." I didn't argue. People who call land just land will never understand. I visited the county recorder's office again, just to be sure. Pulled every plat, every archived zoning document, and took photos of everything. I even paid for an updated legal survey of my property lines, signed and sealed. I sent certified copies to Karen, the HOA office, and their attorney, and then I waited. But Karen wasn't going to stop. She didn't need legal standing. She had something else: momentum and public perception. She knew that if she kept pushing, if she created enough movement, eventually resistance would look like selfishness. She was framing me as the enemy of progress, the bitter old man clinging to a muddy creek. So I went down to the stream with my camera. I filmed everything: the curve of the water as it wrapped around the southern bend, the patches of erosion that already hinted at what would happen if they built too close, the markers from previous floods still visible on the trunks of the sycamores. I dug up photos from 5 years ago, the last time we had a late spring thaw, and the creek swelled 3 feet overnight. I uploaded it all to a private drive and made backups on 3 separate flash drives. If Karen was going to manipulate the narrative, I would build my own arsenal of truth. Then came the construction trailers. 3 of them rolled in on a flatbed parked along the gravel border near the HOA fence. A sign went up the same day: future site of Green Ridge Wellness Retreat coming soon. The trailers weren't on my land yet, but they were close enough to hear the generators hum at night. That evening, I watched a crew unload stacks of timber and prefab foundation supports. Men in hard hats stood around pointing at blueprints. One of them marked a spot near the stream with fluorescent paint. I crossed the boundary line and approached them. "Who's in charge here?" I asked. A man with a clipboard, always a clipboard, turned around. "That'd be me. You, Mr. Granger." "That's right." He nodded, polite but firm. "We were told your land was under dispute and that you'd been informed. We're just setting staging materials for now. No digging yet." "Your materials are 2 feet from my property," I said. "There is no dispute. There is no ambiguity. You're setting up a construction site next to a floodplain on private land, and I'm telling you now you'll lose it all when the water comes." He shrugged. "I just build what I'm paid to build. They always do." The next morning, bulldozers arrived. Not on my land, but close. Karen was preparing to skirt the boundary to build as close as possible without technically crossing the line. She couldn't get my land, so she'd build around it and make it irrelevant. I watched from my porch as crews felled several sycamores and burned the underbrush in controlled piles. The smoke rolled low over the stream, turning the sunlight into a harsh orange glow. Birds fled. Squirrels ran across the gravel path and into my trees. Then I heard something worse. Chainsaws. I ran down the slope. One of the crews was cutting through a branch that had arched over the stream from one of my willows. The tree was on my land, but the branch they claimed hung over community airspace. I shouted for them to stop. The foreman turned to me with a grimace. "It's a hazard," he said. Karen said to clear it. "It obstructs future views." "Touch it again," I said, "and I'll have the sheriff out here in 10 minutes. They stopped, but they didn't apologize. Later that day, a formal letter arrived. Karen had submitted a complaint to the county stating that the branch posed a public safety concern and citing HOA precedent for trimming trees along shared water features. The creek, she now claimed, was a shared amenity. I stared at the letter for a long time. She wasn't just building cabins. She was building a case, and I had to be ready for whatever came next. I woke to the sound of engines, not the gentle hum of distant trucks or the occasional groan of a generator. This was deeper, heavier. Bulldozers. It was still early, barely light out. The air smelled sharp like turned soil and diesel. I threw on my boots, grabbed my phone, and jogged down the path toward the southern edge of my property. The dew was thick on the grass. My dog Max, a quiet old lab mix who never barked unless it mattered, paced nervously at the porch steps but didn't follow. As I crested the rise near the stream, I stopped cold. They were on my land. Not near it, not beside it. On it. One bulldozer had already cut a path through the thicket of blackberry bushes I'd let grow wild for years. The stalks, once tall and tangled and buzzing with bees, now lay in torn heaps, their roots exposed like severed nerves. A crew of 6 men, all in matching fluorescent vests, moved in rhythm chainsaws clearing saplings, a backhoe scraping away the natural slope toward the water. And in the middle of it all, standing with a latte in hand and a walkie-talkie clipped to her windbreaker, was Karen. I stormed down the hill, heart pounding so loud I could barely hear my own steps. "You're on my land!" I shouted loud enough that the engines paused. Heads turned, and even the birds seemed to stop singing. Karen turned slowly, her expression calm. Too calm. Like she had practiced it in the mirror. "We're making adjustments to the gradient," she said. "The engineer said it would improve runoff management. It'll protect the creek in the long term." "This is my land, Karen," I snapped. "I never gave you permission. You're trespassing and you're destroying years of ecosystem I've cared for." She sighed like I was a child throwing a tantrum. "The board voted," she said flat, "and our lawyers determined the creek bed and its banks fall under community easement rights." I pulled the updated survey map from the folder I now carried nearly everywhere. "This shows the boundary line. Your easement doesn't exist. This is my property. And you're going to repair every inch of damage you've done." Karen didn't even look at the papers. "You can argue that with our counsel. In the meantime, I suggest you step back and let the professionals work." I didn't step back. I walked to the bulldozer, stood directly in its path, and raised my phone. "This is being recorded," I said. "You're trespassing. If you continue, I'll press charges." The driver, a young guy in a reflective jacket, froze. "Ma'am," he called out to Karen. She hesitated, then walked over, smiling in that brittle, artificial way that always precedes something poisonous. "I think we've had enough drama for today," she said. "Stand down, please." The machines powered off one by one, their growls fading into silence. Karen turned to me. "You've made your point," she said, "but this doesn't end here." "No," I said quietly. "It really doesn't. The crew packed up and rolled out, leaving behind a scarred stretch of mud-broken roots and the mangled remains of my garden. I walked the site slowly. The wild columbine patch I'd tended for 5 seasons gone. The mossy stepping stones my daughter had placed when she visited years ago dislodged buried under tire tracks. A sapling maple I'd planted for my late father snapped at its base. I stood there feeling something between grief and fury bloom in my chest. This wasn't just landscaping. This was theft. That evening, I sat on my porch and stared out at the ruined slope thinking about my next move. I could call the sheriff, and I would. But I knew how Karen operated. She didn't just bulldoze plants. She bulldozed narratives. By the time law enforcement got involved, she'd have already sent out a newsletter, spun the story about runoff control, maybe even blamed me for neglecting the land. She was playing a long game, and I had to be smarter than her. I called a friend from my Army days, Marcus, now an environmental compliance officer with the state. We hadn't spoken in over a year, but when I explained what had happened, his voice sharpened. "Do you have pictures?" he asked. "Plenty." "Good. Get soil samples. GPS tag the photos. And start documenting everything. If they're disturbing a known waterway without proper permits, they're in violation of state code. And if there's a wetland component, they might be in federal trouble too." I hadn't thought that far ahead. But now the wheels started turning. The next morning, I roped off the damaged area with bright orange tape and nailed up a sign, "Private property. Environmental investigation pending. No trespassing." Then I printed stills from my video footage and mailed copies to the County Planning Commission, the State Department of Environmental Quality, and the local newspaper editor. I didn't know who would bite first, but I knew one thing for sure. Karen had pushed too far. That afternoon, she marched down my driveway. No smile this time. Just fury in every step, her heels crunching like gunfire on gravel. "What is that sign?" she demanded, gesturing at the orange tape. I stayed seated on the porch, calm. "A warning. Legal and visible. Same as your cease and desist letters." "You can't do this," she hissed. "You're interfering with community improvement efforts. This is slander." "Then take me to court," I said. "But just so you know, I've already contacted the state. And you'd better pray they don't come down here with clipboards and questions you can't answer." For the first time, she looked uncertain. "You're bluffing," she said. "Try me." She left without another word. But I knew then I had something she didn't. Not just proof. Patience. Because Karen needed this project fast. She had donors, timelines, a reputation to uphold. But me, I'd waited years for peace. I could wait again. As long as it took. 3 days after I posted the environmental warning signs, I received a letter by certified mail. The envelope was thick, stamped with the logo of a local law firm I'd never heard of, and addressed in the neat corporate font of people who don't get their hands dirty. I knew before I opened it that it came from Karen. I also knew it wouldn't be the last. Inside was a 5-page cease and desist, alleging obstruction, defamation, interference with contractual obligations. And this was the kicker: willful destabilization of HOA-sanctioned development projects. It claimed I had created a hostile and unsafe environment for Greenridge board members and their affiliates, and demanded that I remove all signs, retract all allegations, and refrain from further harassment. If I didn't, they would pursue injunctive relief and civil penalties without further notice. I read it twice slowly, then laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was predictable. Karen didn't want justice. She wanted submission. That same afternoon, I drove straight to my attorney, Connie Mitchell. She'd been my legal guide through the divorce years back, and she was the type of woman who could cross-examine a bear into a whimper. She read the letter, leaned back in her chair, and smirked. "They're trying to scare you," she said. "Do they have anything? Not unless you forged those property lines and faked your birth certificate. You're clean. They're desperate." She agreed to draft a formal response, one that didn't just deny the claims, but laid out the full scope of what Karen had done: the trespassing, the environmental destruction, the attempted coercion. Connie also suggested something else: file a preliminary complaint with the county recorder and land management office. It wouldn't stop Karen outright, but it would throw a bureaucratic wrench into any further accidental development. We did both that same day. The following morning, Karen upped the ante. She hosted a community town hall meeting, public but carefully curated, and invited local media. I wasn't invited, of course, but one of the older residents, Martha from 3 doors down, texted me a photo of the flyer. It was titled, Greenridge speaks protecting progress, preserving peace. Translation: We're going to spin this until the truth is unrecognizable. I went anyway. The event was held in the Greenridge clubhouse, and by the time I arrived, the parking lot was packed. HOA board members in matching polo shirts hovered near the entrance like bouncers. Inside chairs were arranged in perfect rows, and Karen stood at the podium under soft lighting, her blonde bob freshly styled, and every word of her speech dripping with faux concern. "We believe in building a future that respects both nature and neighborhood," she said, gesturing toward the artist renderings of the cabins behind her. "Unfortunately, one individual has chosen to sow division, fabricate claims, and obstruct a project meant to benefit us all." There were murmurs in the crowd. A few heads turned toward me in the back row. I didn't flinch. Karen kept going. "We've endured false accusations, illegal signage, and now legal threats that jeopardize our shared vision. But we remain undeterred." I raised my hand. She paused. For a moment, I saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the internal calculus of whether to let me speak or pretend I didn't exist. She gestured vaguely. "Mr. Granger, I presume." "That's right," I said. "And I have a question." Karen folded her arms. "Go ahead. If you're so confident in your legal position, why did you build on a documented floodplain without permits? Why did you enter my land without consent? And why are you calling my defense of my property harassment?" She didn't answer immediately. The crowd shifted uncertain. "Our legal counsel assures us. I've got 30 years of flood data, 3 independent surveys, and 2 state officials reviewing your actions. Your legal counsel isn't going to stop the river when it rises." Silence. Then someone from the crowd, an older man in a cowboy hat, grunted in approval. Karen smiled tightly. "We appreciate your passion, Mr. Granger, but this isn't the place for personal attacks. You came after my land. That's not personal." She moved on, ignored me. But the tone had shifted. People glanced between us. Whispers began. And for the first time, Karen didn't look like a leader. She looked like a cornered politician. That night, someone egged my truck. I found the shells on the windshield in the morning, drying under the hot sun. It wasn't hard to guess why. Karen had lost control of the narrative, and someone in her camp didn't like it. I didn't report it. But I did install security cameras that afternoon, high-resolution, motion-sensitive, the kind you can watch from your phone. Max barked when I drilled them in like he knew something was shifting too. A day later, the first official response from the county came in. A short, polite email from the Land Management Office. "We've received your complaint and associated documentation. Based on preliminary review, there appears to be sufficient cause to open a land boundary and environmental review. We'll be in touch shortly to schedule a site inspection." It wasn't a victory, but it was movement. The same day, a packet from the Department of Environmental Quality arrived. Inside was a formal acknowledgement of my complaint, along with a case number and a list of questions. They wanted to know dates, photos, maps, names. I gave them everything. That weekend, the crews didn't show up to the retreat site. The backhoe sat idle. The stacks of timber remained untouched. Karen hadn't backed down, but she'd slowed down, and I could feel it. The tide was beginning to turn. The weather forecast called it a Pacific surge, just a fancy way of saying the skies were about to open up. It was early May, the exact time of year when the mountains to the west still held on to snowpack, and a warm rain could mean trouble. For anyone who'd lived in the valley more than a few years, the signs were obvious: swollen tributaries, unusually fast currents, frogs migrating inland. But for someone like Karen, someone who only knew this land from behind tinted windows and legal loopholes, it meant nothing. I had seen it before. Back in 2012, the stream had risen over its banks and flooded 2 neighboring parcels in less than 6 hours. And in 1998, long before the HOA ever existed, a similar surge had taken out an entire footbridge on the old farmland that preceded Greenridge. This land remembered things even if people didn't. So when I stood near the waterline that morning and watched the current whip around the bend like it was late for something, I felt the familiar unease rise in my chest. The stream wasn't babbling, it was rushing. Urgent, hungry. I pulled out my phone and took a video wide-angle, steady hand, timestamp clear. Then I started making calls. First, I called the County Water Authority, left a message with the emergency coordinator. Then I emailed the environmental officer assigned to my complaint, Attaching the footage and a note, stream rising rapidly, historically floods within 72 hours under similar patterns. New construction may be at risk. Recommend immediate inspection. Then, against my better judgment, I called Karen. She didn't pick up. I didn't expect her to. So I left a message. This is Granger. The stream's rising fast. You built too close and the forecast isn't in your favor. You need to move your materials and halt construction now. This isn't a threat, it's a warning. I hung up not because I thought she'd listen, but because I needed the record that I'd tried. The next day, the rain came. Not a drizzle, not a spring shower, sheets. It came sideways, pounding, relentless. The kind of rain that makes the air vibrate, and the trees bend like they're praying. Within 3 hours, the ditch along the HOA fence was overflowing. By nightfall, the little footbridge at the edge of my land had gone under. And still no one came. No crews, no engineers, no Karen. But the cabins were there. Half-built skeletons of eco-luxury, now drenched in cold, silty water that had begun to seep into their substructures. I could see the support beams darkening from where I stood with binoculars. The whole project had been built too close within 20 feet of the stream's high watermark. They had ignored the topography. They had ignored the history. They had ignored me. I emailed photos to every agency on my contact list. The next morning, I got a response from the county. A site inspector will be dispatched within 48 hours pending road conditions. Too late, I thought, because that night the storm returned. Harder. Wind lashed the trees until the younger ones bowed sideways. Lightning cracked over the ridge like a whip. The creek, which had become a river, roared loud enough to wake me at 2:14 a.m. I grabbed my flashlight and jacket and walked to the edge of my land. What I saw stopped me cold. The cabins were swaying. Not dramatically yet, but you could see it. The mud was giving. The slope which Karen's engineers had shaved down for aesthetics was losing integrity. Two of the structures tilted slightly to the left, their footings no longer square. Debris from upstream branches, trash, even someone's overturned kayak, was slamming into the bank with force. I took out my phone, filmed everything. At 3:07 a.m., I heard a snap. Then another. And then, the unmistakable sound of something large being pulled loose slowly at first, then all at once. The first cabin slid. It didn't crumble. It floated for about 5 seconds, just long enough for my heart to leap into my throat, and then tipped sideways into the torrent and smashed against the concrete culvert farther down. Wood splintered. A window shattered. The structure was gone before I could even hit stop on the recording. The second one followed within 20 minutes. I kept filming, not because I wanted this, but because no one else would believe it. When the rain let up just after dawn, I stood outside on my porch, soaked, exhausted, and half-stunned. The stream had retreated slightly, but the damage was done. 4 cabins gone. 2 more half-submerged. Karen showed up around 8 a.m., wearing a hooded trench coat and carrying an umbrella that whipped uselessly in the wind. She walked down the ridge path with one of the project managers trailing her like a lost child. When she saw the destruction, she froze. I watched from behind my gate. She turned slowly and caught sight of me standing there. Her expression wasn't angry. It was terrified. For a moment, we just looked at each other. Then she shouted, "You did this." I blinked. "Excuse me." "You sabotaged the bank. You manipulated the water flow. You've been trying to stop this project from the beginning, and now you've destroyed it." I actually laughed. Not out of cruelty, but disbelief. "You think I control the river," I said. "That I caused a flash flood? Maybe check the weather service before you start screaming." She shook her head unhinged. "You warned me. You called. You knew this would happen." "I did warn you, because I've lived here long enough to respect this land. You didn't listen. You never do." She turned to her manager. "Call the sheriff. I want him arrested." The man hesitated. "For what?" Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. There was no answer that wouldn't sound insane. She stormed back up the hill, and I stood there cold, tired, and oddly calm. Because no matter what happened next, one thing was finally clear to everyone who had ever doubted me. I had told the truth, and the river had just proved it for me. By dusk that evening, the storm had moved on, but the damage it left behind lingered like smoke after a fire. The air smelled of wet earth, snapped roots, and something sharper loss. I didn't sleep much that night. Even after the rain stopped, the sounds didn't. The rush of water had embedded itself in my mind, roaring beneath every other thought. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of black coffee that I never touched, Max curled at my feet, his old body still trembling slightly from the earlier thunder. Every hour I checked the stream. Every hour I recorded footage. Not because I expected more cabins to fall, but because I needed documentation. Because Karen had already accused me once, and I knew the next move was coming. By 600 a.m., the crews were back. Not the usual ones. These weren't construction workers or engineers. These were emergency contractors, guys with clipboards and waterproof boots and phones that never left their hands. They parked along the HOA road, surveyed the wreckage in silence, and began fencing off the slope with yellow tape. Not to protect the stream, of course, but to protect what was left of Karen's investment. 3 cabins had disappeared completely. 2 more stood askew, their foundations twisted and half swallowed by mud. The 6th, the one furthest uphill, had survived barely. But even from where I stood, it was clear the entire retreat site was compromised. And the river wasn't done. I watched one man kneel to take a soil sample from the stream bank. Another measured the sink along the lower terrace, where water had carved out a deep groove overnight. One cabin's hot tub now rested 30 feet downstream, wedged between 2 elder trees like a lost UFO. Plastic lounge chairs bobbed in the current. Strips of insulation fluttered from the high branches. It looked like war. And for once, it wasn't a metaphor. At 9:00 a.m., the sheriff's deputy arrived. It was Deputy Lane, a younger guy, maybe early 30s, always polite, always measured. He parked his cruiser at the bottom of my driveway, walked up to my gate, and tipped his hat. "Morning, Mr. Granger." "Let me guess," I said. "Karen sent you." He nodded. "She filed a formal complaint, accusation of property sabotage, and willful negligence." "Of course she did. She also says you threatened her." I laughed, but it wasn't angry. I warned her. Same as I warned the county, the board, and every contractor who stepped foot on this land. The river doesn't care about your permits. "I believe you," he said quietly. "I saw the time-stamped footage, the flood maps, the emails. You were right." I looked at him, surprised. He shifted his weight awkwardly. "My aunt lives down the road. She's been here 30 years. She told me about the '98 flood. Showed me the high water line on her garage door. Said she warned the HOA last year not to build near the stream." "Let me guess," I said. "They called her dramatic." He half smiled. "That's about right. So what now?" He sighed. "Technically, we have to investigate. I need to take your statement. Then it goes to the county. But between us, this doesn't look like sabotage. It looks like karma." I gave him everything. Photos, videos, the call log, even the voicemail I'd left Karen the day before the storm. He took it all, thanked me, and promised to write the report as clearly as the evidence allowed. As he drove away, I finally let myself exhale. But it didn't last long. By noon, a news van pulled up. Then another. Somewhere, someone had leaked the story. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe a disgruntled crew member. Or maybe Karen herself trying to spin the narrative before the truth hardened. Either way, the media circus had arrived. They set up on the HOA road, aiming long camera lenses down at the wreckage like tourists at a crime scene. One reporter tried to walk down my driveway, mic in hand. I stopped him with a shake of my head. "Private property," I said. No comment. He looked disappointed. But then he asked something unexpected. "Is it true you warned them?" I paused, then nodded. "Yes, I warned them, and I have proof." He didn't press further. That evening, I watched the local 6 o'clock broadcast. There she was, Karen standing in front of the last cabin, still upright, her makeup perfect, her expression solemn. "This is a tragedy," she said. "A heartbreaking setback for our community's vision. We believe the flooding was exacerbated by upstream disruptions, and we're looking into all potential causes." Behind her, the word sabotage flashed across the screen. I nearly choked on my tea. Then the segment cut to drone footage of the stream, and for the first time, the camera angle didn't lie. The slope, the erosion, the proximity of the cabins to the water. It all told a story no amount of PR could undo. And then, bless them, they cut to my interview. Not a live one. Just a brief clip from earlier that afternoon. I was standing by the stream, arms crossed, water rushing behind me. I told them, I said. Not because I wanted to be right, but because I knew what would happen if they kept pushing. The river doesn't negotiate. That line made its way to social media. Within an hour, it had been reposted hundreds of times. By midnight, thousands. The comments poured in. And this man warned them, respect the land. Another HOA disaster. When will they learn that stream has more integrity than the board, Who builds cabins on a floodplain and blames the water? For once, the internet was on my side. But Karen wasn't done. At 6:42 a.m. the next day, a process server arrived with another envelope. She was suing me for defamation, loss of business, and emotional distress. I laughed as I signed for the papers. Then I called Connie. Her voice, when she heard the news, was low and deliberate. Good, she said. Let them take it to court. Why, I asked. Because it means discovery. And when we open that door, we'll pull every document, every email, every internal memo from the HOA. She paused. And we'll make sure this time everyone sees the truth. I always believed there was a certain dignity in silence. In the Army, we were taught that the loudest guy in the room was usually the most afraid. After I retired, I took that lesson with me, spoke only when it mattered, acted when others hesitated, and let the land do most of the talking. But Karen never met a silence she didn't try to fill with noise. The morning after I was served with her lawsuit, I stepped outside and found 3 reporters parked across from my fence line. One of them was already filming his lens, pointed straight at my cabin. Another waved cheerily and called out, "Mr. Granger, do you have any comments about the lawsuit?" I didn't answer. Instead, I walked over to the mailbox where the lawsuit papers had been dropped the night before. The corner of the envelope had gone soggy in the storm. Fitting. Inside were more than a dozen pages of dense legalese. Karen claimed I had willfully defamed her good-standing, sabotaged community trust, and orchestrated a smear campaign to disrupt development and financially destabilize a democratically elected board. She made me sound like a Bond villain with a weed trimmer. I carried the envelope inside and laid it on the kitchen table beside a half-dozen files of my own floodplain maps, satellite imagery, drone footage, and emails from residents who had started to reach out quietly, at first expressing doubt, regret, even apology. One woman, Bethany, wrote, "I didn't know the retreat was on your land. Karen made it sound like you were squatting on HOA space. I'm so sorry." That same day, Connie filed our formal countersuit. It wasn't just a defense, we went on the offensive: trespassing, property damage, environmental violations, harassment, abuse of process. Connie's voice when she said the last one was steel cold. "I'll handle the courtroom," she told me. "You just keep being right." But outside the courtroom, the HOA was unraveling. That week's emergency meeting was broadcast online, one of the few concessions the board had made after the public backlash. Karen sat at the head of the table, but the power in her posture was gone. Her eyes darted as other members read off community complaints. 6 cabins lost, one member said flatly. Estimated cost over $2.2 million. Insurance claims denied, another added, because of proximity to known floodplain. Karen tried to steer the meeting. She brought up weather anomalies, act of God, and then, unbelievably, me. There is credible evidence, she said, that Mr. Granger may have interfered with natural water flow, intentionally exacerbating the flood. The silence in the room was instant. One man coughed, another rubbed his eyes. The board chair, an older gentleman named Rick, who had once voted with Karen on everything, finally spoke up. "You're saying a retired vet redirected a river?" Karen didn't blink. "He has experience with field engineering. He's resourceful. And he's been openly hostile to this project from the beginning." Rick raised an eyebrow. "So your theory is he engineered a flood?" Karen pressed on. "He tampered with soil, erected barriers. He could have dug a trench upstream, diverted runoff. It was absurd, delusional, and I watched it live from my laptop with a cold knot forming in my gut. Because as ridiculous as it sounded, I knew what she was doing. She wasn't trying to win in that meeting. She was seeding doubt, confusion, conspiracy. And in HOA politics, sometimes confusion was enough to buy time. The next day, another letter came. This one wasn't legal. It was HOA formal. A violation notice. The envelope was thick cardstock embossed with the Green Ridge seal. It accused me of unauthorized alterations to communal hydrological features. It included photographs of my old wooden footbridge, now half submerged, and claimed it had diverted natural stream flow in a hazardous manner. I wanted to scream. Instead, I documented. I photographed the bridge from every angle, showing that it hadn't shifted at all during the flood. I filmed the upstream and downstream flow to show consistency. I even used a drone to map the bank contour, proving it matched the historical elevation. Connie compiled everything into a digital folder labeled River Lies. Still, Karen's PR machine didn't stop. Within days, the HOA newsletter was plastered with subtle digs. In these challenging times, let us remember that obstruction and negativity only deepen disaster. We must stand united against falsehoods. And worse, they launched a petition thinly veiled as a community healing initiative, calling for the removal of hostile, non-member neighbors. Only one person fit that description, me. But not everyone bought it anymore. 2 days after the newsletter dropped, Rick, the same board member who once parroted Karen's every word, knocked on my door. He stood on my porch with his cap in hand and a hesitant look in his eyes. "I came to apologize," he said. I stepped aside. We sat on the porch for a long while. He drank the coffee I made him, quiet and grateful, and stared at the stream like it had answers written on the surface. "I never knew," he said, "about the floodplain, about your deed. Karen showed us different maps. She knew," I said. "She just didn't care." He nodded slowly. "I'm stepping down after this quarter," he said. "I've already filed the paperwork. I can't be part of this anymore." I thanked him. Not because it changed everything, but because it meant something had finally cracked. The next day, the state inspector returned. This time with 2 colleagues, heavy boots and clipboards so full I thought the table might collapse. They took water samples, measured sediment drift, and spent nearly 3 hours interviewing me while reviewing the footage of the flood. As they left, one of them turned to me. "We've reviewed your footage. We're also reviewing drone surveillance from public and environmental agencies. If what we suspect is true, Green Ridge built without a proper hydrology report." "What does that mean?" "It means," she said carefully, "that someone signed off on permits they didn't have. And if it was willful, there could be criminal consequences." Criminal. The word echoed louder than any lawsuit Karen could throw at me. That night, I stood by the stream and watched the water flow smooth and clear again. The rage was gone from it. The wreckage had moved downstream. It had left scars, yes, but it had also exposed everything that needed to be seen. Karen had built her empire on the illusion of control, and the river had just reminded her, nature doesn't care about your rules. By now, the story had outgrown our little neighborhood. What started as a private dispute between a homeowner and an HOA president had become a slow-moving avalanche, picking up speed with every interview, every photo, every cabin washed away by that rising river. Local news stations were still running HOA versus homeowner segments. The state's Department of Environmental Quality had made multiple unannounced visits. And Karen. She'd gone from confidently calling reporters to carefully curating silence. But silence wasn't going to save her. The county had finally scheduled a formal hearing. It wasn't a court case yet, just a public land use review at the municipal hall. But everyone knew what it meant: testimony records, and for the first time, everything out in the open. I was asked to bring anything relevant to the dispute. Maps, footage, communications, anything that could help the board assess the sequence of events and land jurisdictional boundaries, the clerk said on the phone. Anything. I brought everything. The morning of the hearing, I walked into that stuffy government building with a heavy-duty Pelican case tucked under one arm and a laptop bag on my shoulder. Inside the case were 30 years of documentation, some mine, some recovered through FOIA requests, and some anonymously mailed to me by people I suspected used to be Karen's allies. Paper maps, USB drives, aerial photos, a stack of printed emails, even original flood insurance denials from the 1998 surge that first taught me to respect the stream's wrath. Karen was already there when I arrived. She sat 3 rows ahead, dressed sharply, in a charcoal blazer, hair pulled tight, face unreadable. A man I recognized as her attorney whispered something to her as I passed, and she didn't turn around. The hearing room was modest folding chairs in neat lines, a small dais, with 5 county planning board officials seated behind microphones, and 2 small projector screens hanging from opposite corners. The HOA brought a few supporters, mostly board members with tense expressions and a nervous energy that reeked of guilt by association. Connie arrived moments before it started, carrying a leather binder with color-coded tabs and the kind of calm that came from knowing you had the better hand. When the board chair finally called my name, I walked up, slowly opened my case, and began unpacking. I didn't speak right away. Instead, I connected my laptop to the projector and loaded the first file, a time-lapse video I'd created from drone footage showing the gradual approach of construction over the months, bulldozers rolling in tree lines being stripped, cabins taking shape, and then water. rising, rushing, swallowing. Cabin after cabin sliding sideways like driftwood. Then I spoke. I bought my land, 17 years ago I began. The deed clearly marks the boundaries, and for all those years I've maintained it without interference. That changed the day this HOA decided to build a luxury retreat on a floodplain they never studied. I clicked to the next slide, FEMA flood risk maps overlaid with satellite imagery. This stream, what they called a cute little creek, has flooded 5 times in the last 20 years. These maps show it. Every cabin they built was within 25 feet of the high water mark. No permits, no inspections, just assumptions. The board members leaned in. Karen stiffened. I kept going. I showed photos of construction crews flattening my garden. A video of a bulldozer crossing into my legal boundary, complete with GPS timestamp. Copies of cease and desist letters I'd received ironically accusing me of trespass on my own land. A spreadsheet detailing every warning I'd issued, including voicemail transcriptions and email confirmations. Then came the crown jewel. 2 weeks ago, I said an anonymous source mailed me a copy of this. I held up a printed email chain between Karen and the HOA's private engineering consultant. In it, the consultant explicitly warned, preliminary soil tests confirm high erosion risk. I recommend pulling cabin sites at least 40 feet back. Without that, you're risking slope failure during peak runoff. Karen's response, push forward. We've already sold the concept to the board. The resident will fold once construction begins. The room fell silent. The county board chair rubbed his temples. Another member whispered something into the mic and passed a note down the line. Karen sat motionless, her jaw tight, but her eyes betrayed it all. She knew what I had just done. Because now it wasn't just a natural disaster. It was willful negligence. After I sat down, the room seemed to shift. Board members took notes furiously. The county planner asked for copies of all my evidence, which I had already prepared on thumb drives labeled by date and file type. Even the HOA lawyer, red-faced and visibly sweating, didn't raise a single objection. When Karen finally rose to speak, her voice lacked its usual sharpness. She rambled. She blamed conflicting maps and miscommunications. She said the flood was unforeseeable, despite every chart, every expert, every time-worn scar on the land saying otherwise. She never once apologized. After the hearing, people approached me in the parking lot, neighbors, strangers, even one board member who had previously voted for the retreat. You really did your homework, one said. I'm sorry I didn't believe you, another offered. I see it now. I nodded, but I didn't feel victorious. Not yet. Because as much as the truth had finally surfaced, the river had already taken its toll. The land I loved had been carved into. Trees lost, wildlife displaced. What used to be mine alone had been exposed, challenged, scarred, but still standing. And sometimes that's enough. 2 days later, the county suspended all HOA development projects pending a full environmental audit. A week after that, the state launched an investigation into permit fraud. And that Friday, Karen resigned from the board. Her statement was brief, hollow. A paragraph about new professional opportunities and regrettable misunderstandings. No mention of the cabins. No mention of me, but she was gone. And as I sat on my porch that evening, watching the stream ripple quietly again beneath the first orange streaks of sunset, I realized something strange. I didn't feel anger anymore, just relief. Because sometimes the only justice you get is the truth told in full view with nothing left to hide. It had been 3 months since the hearing, and the silence along the stream was different now. Not fragile, not uneasy, but earned. The summer heat had arrived early, warming the stones along the creek and drawing dragonflies back to hover above the banks. The current was calm again, not raging or swollen or carving out new scars in the earth. It simply flowed as it always had, asking nothing of anyone except maybe patience. I'd rebuilt the garden. Not all of it, some things like my father's maple sapling couldn't be replaced, but enough to make the land feel like itself again. I planted new wild columbines near the waterline, added a border of native ferns, and laid fresh stones across the trail that ran from my porch to the base of the hill. Max had taken to lying in the shade again, tail thumping when I passed with a spade or watering can. We were healing the both of us. And the cabins, gone. Every last one of them had been dismantled by court order after the state environmental audit confirmed the floodplain violations and the county revoked the HOA's retroactive permit requests. What hadn't already been washed away was pulled apart piece by piece. The concrete footings were jackhammered out of the soil. The debris was hauled off in quiet, shameful truckloads. Even the Zen Den sign ended up in a dumpster behind the HOA office. In its place, nothing. And that was the point. The land for once had been allowed to breathe. But the bigger shift, the one that truly settled something in me, came not from the county or the court. It came from the community. A week after Karen's resignation, the HOA board held an open forum meeting. It was the first time I'd been invited officially. I almost didn't go. I didn't need more eyes on me, didn't crave the nods of approval or the long, awkward apologies. But curiosity won out, and so did a sense of quiet responsibility. When I arrived, the room was full. Not packed, but full in the way that matters residents, who normally never attended some. I'd only waved to from across the grocery aisle. Others who used to look away when we crossed paths. And at the center of it all, a new board chair, Dana. She stood behind the podium with a notepad in her hand and sincerity in her eyes. "We can't undo what's happened," she said, "but we can choose to learn from it. The HOA will no longer pursue development in environmentally sensitive areas. Effective immediately, we're also creating a land respect and stewardship committee, open to both members and non-members, so we never again confuse ownership with understanding." She looked directly at me when she said that last part. A few people clapped, not performatively, just soft real. I didn't stand, I didn't speak, but I nodded. And somehow that was enough. The next morning, I found a handwritten note in my mailbox. No envelope. Just folded lined paper creased in half. It read, "I believed her. I shouldn't have. Thank you for protecting the stream. Thank you for not giving up." It wasn't signed. Didn't need to be. Sometimes healing doesn't announce itself. It just shows up quietly, in small gestures and softened glances. A space at the table. A conversation that wasn't possible before. And sometimes justice isn't a gavel or a verdict. It's an old man standing on his land, still holding it after the storm. A few weeks later, I applied to have the lower acre of my property designated as a protected natural buffer. Not a park, not a development site, just an official recognition of what it had always been, a living ecosystem with a memory longer than any board term or building permit. The paperwork came through fast, thanks to the new committee. That same weekend, I posted a small wooden sign near the edge of the stream. Hand-carved, simple. It read, "Let the river speak. No fences, no warning, just a reminder." People started coming by, not in droves, but often enough. Parents with kids, couples on evening walks, teenagers with sketchbooks. I even saw someone bring a lawn chair one afternoon and just sit, eyes closed, listening to the water move. The HOA didn't stop them. In fact, one of the newer board members emailed me personally to ask if they could feature the area in the next community newsletter, not as a recreational site, but as a lesson in stewardship. I said yes. Not for them, but for the land. One afternoon, Dana stopped by. We sat on the porch sipping lemonade while Max snored between us. She said I'd been going through the board's old emails. Dangerous pastime, I joked. She smiled. There were signs, warnings buried in reports ignored or overridden. We all could have done more. I just wanted you to know. We're trying to rebuild trust. You can't rebuild trust, I said. You grow it. She nodded, and for the first time in months, I felt no resentment toward anyone on the other side of that fence line. We watched the stream for a while, neither of us speaking. Eventually, Dana stood. Before leaving, she turned back. "She's selling her house, you know." "Karen." "Yeah, moving to Florida." I chuckled. "Hope she checks the flood zones first." She laughed, shook her head, and walked off down the gravel path. As the sun dipped below the ridge, I stood and stretched, bones cracking in the way they only do after a life fully lived. I walked down the path to the water's edge, let my fingers trail through the cool current. Max joined me, easing into a comfortable patch of grass. And there, with the last light catching the ripples just right, I closed my eyes and listened. No engines, no shouting, no construction. Just water. Just peace. And after everything that had been taken, buried, drowned, and rebuilt, it was more than enough.